Hello, everyone. Thank you for watching. If you're watching on YouTube and listening, if you're listening on the podcast, I have another special guest this week. He is Chris with B-Ball History and BBallhistory.com. Chris has created his B-Ball History website to sort of um, come up with rankings of what past teams and past great players, how to kind of go through the history of both the NBA and college basketball, and kind of have to do a ranking process for some of the greatest that have ever played. He's also on Instagram as B-Ball History, where he puts up his basketball card collection because he is a basketball card collector as well. So, Chris, first of all, thank you for joining. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And so I asked Chris to come on because I wanted to have a debate about the 50 greatest players to ever play in the NBA. And I thought Chris would be a good person to do that because of what the work that he's already kind of done on his website. Real quick, Chris, do you want to go ahead and talk about your website real quick to everyone and give kind of a quick plug on it?
Sure. No, I appreciate that. Around, I want to say about 8 years ago, I started BBallhistory.com. And really, the goal of that website, I wound up having a lot of time on my hands because I was done with graduate school and I wanted to just do something fun. So I decided to run a tournament of, all right, how do we compile a roster of the greatest players for each franchise? And how would those franchises essentially compete in a tournament? So you could think about, it's pretty obvious who the best franchises are in an exercise like that, right? The Lakers and Celtics have 33 combined championships. So
It's kind of hard to beat the Celtics or Lakers as a franchise,
completely,
like.
completely. But it was so the ending wasn't necessarily in suspense during it, but I think it was just the process of identifying, okay, like what would be the 12-man roster for the Washington Bullets / Wizards, right? Like what would be the roster for the Warriors, thinking of all the different eras of Warrior basketball, some of which were very successful, some of which were not. So it was a lot of fun putting together those teams. Even looking back, I feel like, oh, I would have done a few things differently. But the ultimate conclusion, I think, was the right one, where the Lakers are the most star-heavy team in NBA history, and I think their franchise would be sort of most prominent in an exercise like that. And ever since, they've added LeBron James and Anthony Davis, right? So they would win for the foreseeable future in an exercise like that. But I just wanted to have fun and really do a tournament where I could really work through the greatest players in each franchise's history and show how they would compete against one another. And then I'd really just tried to identify just other topics that would be fun to write about. So I really restarted it during the pandemic and talked about, all right, what were the greatest Game 7 performances in NBA history? What were some of the worst Game 7 performances in NBA history? Just topics like that I thought were really just fun to look over and to research. And again, I can't say I've updated it recently, but it is fun to sort of go back and just look over some of those topics and think about how I would update it going forward. And I will update it. It's just on the back burner with other priorities. But it's been a fun little exercise for me.
Yeah, and so I think it's always fun to kind of go through that and think about like tiers of great players or great teams throughout the history of the NBA, of course. And so, as a basketball collector, of course, as well, I obviously think it's very important to understand um, who were the greatest players throughout NBA history. Obviously, it's easy to recognize the obvious names like Michael Jordan and LeBron James and Kobe and all those probably top 10 guys on most people's list, but to kind of also be aware of other guys that have played in the NBA that will probably go down as the 50 greatest players or 75, whatever your list is. You can have all kinds of lists. That's what's great about being a sports fan. But yeah, just kind of knowing throughout the decades who are the best players that have ever played, whether it's the 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on. Just so you have a good understanding of why certain cards or certain players from certain sets have more distinction than other players and from other eras and things of that nature. So just a good overall lesson of NBA history, I think, is important to being a good basketball card collector. What are your thoughts on that?
I completely agree. I've been following basketball all my life, and the history has really always attracted me. So, I really started get into basketball as the Jordan dynasty was ramping up, right? And just going back and comparing it to other dynasties, really learning about the Bill Russell Celtics, learning about the parity in the '70s, even going back further about the Minneapolis Lakers and really understanding some of the key players in each era has been a passion of mine. And that's translated into my collection as I think about, all right, like what are the vintage rookie cards that, I'd really want to prioritize? How do I want to sort of really honor NBA history through the cards that I'm collecting. And that's sort of the lens that I try to have in terms of really trying to collect rookie cards from different eras and great players and Hall of Fame players throughout the game's history.
Yeah. So I wanted to kind of go through and talk about who are the 50 greatest players in NBA history. So I asked you to kind of come up with a list. You what is how did you kind of do your list? Did you kind of do yours in order, or did you kind of just do it as in tiers or alphabetically? What was the basis of your list as we go through this?
Yeah, I would say it's more in tiers where, I think the first, I would say 10 to 12 are sort of rise above the rest for me. And then thinking about that sort of next tier of great players, I really thought about it like that. And then I think there's a whole bunch of players who can be included in the third tier, who all time great players who might not rise to the level of those first two. So I really started off just ranking by position who I thought were the best players. And then from there, really thinking about, all right, how does this sort of come together with regard to just overall across positions and across eras.
Okay, so in terms of your first tier or top tier, however you want to say it, how many players are in that tier? Let's start off by kind of going through your tiers in order, and you give me your list in each tier, and then I'll kind of respond to that and let you know how those players rank in my personal ranking because I have my ranking in numbered order. But yeah, we'll start with your tiers. We'll go to your top tier first because the top tier are the names that most people are going to be familiar with, and we're not going to need to necessarily educate people on like the top 10 or top 15 or whatever greatest, however many is in your top tier.
Yes. So I have 12 players in that sort of top tier. And I think you can tier this within the tier, but sort of 12 players who, I think just showed the ability to lead championship teams, to thrive in the playoffs, to, just all the things that I feel like are important. Really, really, that playoff aspect I think is particularly relevant. How do you perform under pressure? How do you elevate teammates and really, really come through in the clutch? So I have a 12 player list, and do you want me to go through it?
Yeah,
Perfect.
go ahead
So
and
again,
go
I
through
don't
that.
think
Yeah.
okay, I don't think this is anything surprising, right? Like with regard to who would be in this tier. But I have Michael Jordan, I have LeBron James, I have Kareem, I have Bill Russell, Magic Johnson, Tim Duncan, Wilt Chamberlain, Larry Bird, Kobe Bryant, Steph Curry, Shaquille O'Neal, and Akeem Olajuwon.
Okay. Um, you started off by naming them almost exactly in order the way I have them in my numbered ranking. I still definitely have Jordan number one, LeBron number two, Kareem number three, Russell number four. I feel like those four guys definitely are on most people's top five lists of all time. I don't know. There's really too much to say about that, other than I truly think those are like the four goats as you go through like each sort of time period of NBA history. Bill Russell was the original GOAT of the '60s and for '50s and '60s era, and then Kareem was the GOAT probably throughout the '70s and '80s. And then Jordan became the GOAT of all time, probably when he hit his apex in the '90s. LeBron has been the GOAT for the past 20 years, but I still don't think he's surpassed the greatness of Jordan. I think you can have debate about LeBron and Kareem and LeBron and Russell. If you still want to rank those guys ahead of LeBron, I certainly don't mind that. But to me, I still think those are definitely the four cream of the crop GOATs throughout NBA history.
And can I think that's a great. I would agree. I think we might get some pushback from folks on Russell, right? Considering the sort of offensive numbers, right? And obviously you have some folks who are Wilt Chamberlain fans, and Wilt was amazing. But I think the ability to elevate the team and being the greatest defensive player of all time, I think those are things that would translate to many different eras, right? I don't think Bill Russell would be, some bench warmer in, 2000 basketball, right? I think he obviously there are differences among eras that we have to respect, but his defensive impact and his leadership, I just feel like elevate him above Wilt. Even though I feel like Wilt was a more talented player, right? And Wilt put on an amazing, almost facsimile of Russell, right? When he was on the Lakers, I think Wilt found the most balance when he was on the 76ers. And, for those 3.5 seasons, Wilt might have been the greatest center of all time, right? Those sort of 76ers seasons. I think it's between that and, Kareem's Buck seasons and maybe Russell's best stretch in Boston. But I know Wilt didn't play like that his whole career, and I think there are just enough small things about Wilt that I put Russell above him. But I think it's a wonderful debate.
Yeah. And so, yeah, right after Russell, I have Magic 5, Wilt 6, Bird 7, Kobe 8, Duncan 9. Those next five guys, you can definitely probably rank them, order them in 1,000 different ways if you ask 1,000 different people. They were both great for different reasons. All of them were like champions, best players in the league for about 10 years or so. Like, there's a lot of yeah, I mean, it really just kind of depends on personal preference, probably. And I think most people, once again, will probably have these guys in some order in like a top 10 ranking of all time great players, most likely. After that, probably does get a little murky for a lot of people. So on my list for like the next three or four, I had Shaq number 10,
Mhm.
Hakeem 11, and I had Durant 12. And you had Steph in your top tier, right?
I did.
Ahead of Durant or ahead of Shaq? I can't remember now.
I had a Durant.
Durant, yeah. Um, so that's where we kind of start off with some of the interesting debates. I don't think too many people will debate about Shaq and Hakeem being ranked that high. That's great. Yeah, I don't know if we need necessarily get into them. So Steph is an interesting one for sure. I certainly understand putting Steph in your top tier now because I think when it's all said and done, it's very possible he can add another championship to his resume. It's very possible he can add all sorts of other accolades before he's done retiring or before he's done, because he'll probably have maybe a little bit longer of a career than KD will. Obviously, KD came into the league a little bit before Steph did, but KD has also been riddled with more injuries lately as he's gotten into his 30s. Steph seems like he's going to be playing until probably late 30s, maybe even into his 40s. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to put a curse on him or anything like that. So yeah, so that's certainly an interesting one of where you put guys like Steph and Durant, since they're still obviously still playing and still adding to their legacy potentially as we move forward.
Yeah, I think it's a great debate. For me, it comes down to Steph Curry's ability to elevate his teammates. I feel like is a little higher than Durant's, and the reason why I say that is thinking about Steph's gravity and his ultimate impact on winning. You think about the 2015 championship, right? Golden State's first championship. He's the clear star in that team. I know Iguodala for some reason won Finals MVP, but in reality, Steph averaged about 27 points that series and was the real Finals MVP in my mind. 2016 is obviously a big black mark on his resume. Not winning that championship in the 73 win season, and then obviously they joined forces, right? So I think it was the truest 1A, 1B pairing since sort of the later versions of Kobe and Shaq, right? And you think about Elgin and Jerry, like there are few times when it's a real true 1A, 1B and not a 1-1-2 in terms of the combo and sort of the ordering of the combo. So, I think those championships, it's tough to gauge. I know Durant won the finals MVP both seasons, but I think you could really make an argument that Curry was the one who had the most impact. I think, that's sort of a wash to me. And then we saw what happened in 2022, right? Steph,
Yeah.
maybe his greatest accomplishment, sort of leading the Warriors back to another championship. And Durant just hasn't been able to have that same, whether it's injury luck or the players that he chooses to play with, he just hasn't had the same impact since they broke up. Now, I will say one feather in KD's cap. I will say I believe it was in 2021, the year that Bucks won. I felt like Durant was the best player in basketball when he almost single-handedly beat Milwaukee, and he was putting up those absurd stat lines in that Milwaukee series. I really thought that's when he finally, became the man in the league. But it was short-lived, and that year Giannis won the championship, and then the next year Steph did, and Durant just hasn't been able to get to the mountaintop without Curry. So I'd put Steph slightly above him. I completely understand the other argument, but the ability to lead multiple championship teams is what did it for me.
Yeah, no, I do agree that championship Curry won in 2022 did a lot for his legacy, and the fact that since KD left the Warriors, he hasn't been able to win his own championship. He still has time, obviously, so I do think that is going to matter a lot to people when anyone who does these type of rankings. Thinking about KD post KD career, he probably has to win at least one more championship kind of on his own because he only got the championships in Golden State when he teamed up with Steph. He wasn't able to do it in Oklahoma City. They got really close several times and they just couldn't quite do it. Things happen in Brooklyn that we all are aware of. We can probably forgive the Brooklyn years, but he's got to do something either in Phoenix or whatever team happens after Phoenix. But it has to happen probably in his whatever how many years he has left. He probably does need to go ahead and get his own championship to cement his legacy in most people's top 12, top 15, whatever list, right?
Yeah, I 100% agree. It's not like I have Durant far off, right? Like we're talking about a top 15 player in my mind, but I think of this first tier as all right. Those no doubters who can lead their teams to championships, right? Despite the sort of circumstances around them, right? Like you obviously need talent, but showing the ability multiple times to lead different talent to the mountaintop is what separated this tier to me.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and talk about your next tier then. How many players are in this next tier? And if you want to go ahead and go through that.
Yeah, why don't I go through it? It's a little fluid for me, to be honest. I think it's pretty clear at the top, and then I think there are several people at the end that you can include. So the way I broke it down, like I mentioned, Durant is right at the top of the list, right, along with Kevin Garnett, who I think is severely underrated. Again, the sort of factor thinking about how important defense is and his impact on that end of the court. I have Jerry West, Oscar Robertson, Julius Irving, Bob Pettit, who is criminally underrated, Moses Malone, Elgin Baylor, and Dirk Nowitzki. I have them sort of no doubters in this list. And then I think there are a few others who can be included, who I didn't quite include. But, I think I'll stop there and get your reaction. And then I could talk about maybe some of the others who we can think about including here.
Right. Once again, yeah, I think all the players you named on this tier, once again, are players that I feel like most people will definitely have somewhere in some order in the top 20 or top 25 of greatest all time NBA players. So on my list, after I have Durant at 12, I have Jerry West, and then I have Julius Irving, Oscar Robertson, Elgin Baylor, Steph Curry, Moses Malone. I put Charles Barkley ahead of Garnett still, but once again, you can kind of make a definite debate. So those are my next in order up to number 20, And then shortly after that are guys like Karl Malone and Isaiah Thomas and John Havlicek
Yeah.
that didn't quite make that list. And so I guess I have Nowitzki ranked a little bit lower than you would, and I have
Mhm.
Barkley ranked a little bit higher. So I guess we can have a little quick debate about the merits of those two guys and why you have Nowitzki ranked in that tier with those other players that I think definitely should belong in that tier for sure.
Yeah, for me with Dirk, it was the Mavericks seem to always have a rotating cast of players. Like they seem like they started off with the sort of Nash Nowitzki, Michael Finley group, right? And that team was really fun. Got to a Western Conference Finals against Duncan, but they weren't able to sort of break through. And then they let Nash go, right? Like they didn't re-sign him because of his back, and completely disastrous, just summer, right? I think they signed like Eric Dampier with that money, or someone who couldn't really play. But then, despite losing one of the greatest players ever in Steve Nash, Dirk leads his team to the finals in '06. Obviously, that didn't go as well as planned, right? But just elevating his team multiple times when the cast was sort of rotating, right? So you sort of went from that Steve Nash and Michael Finley group to Jason Terry and Josh Howard, right? Were his sort of main supporting cast. And then they reinvented themselves again. They lost at finals. They lost a disastrous next year when they were their number one seed and they lost to the We Believe Warriors. And then they reinvented themselves again to finally that great group in 2011, where they were just this great ensemble cast with Tyson Chandler and Jason Kidd. Jason Terry was still there, Sean Marion, and they won the championship. So I just feel like Dirk was the fulcrum of multiple good teams. I think they won 50 games about 9 times in a row. And I just feel like he was central to winning. And, I think like for a while it was hard to reconcile. All right, how do you compare Dirk to a Karl Malone or Charles Barkley? Some of the guys who are more traditional power forwards who were awesome in their day. But for me, that sort of the winning that he did with multiple casts is why I have him in this tier, slightly above those other two.
Yeah, and it's a good argument, of course. Obviously, yeah, the 2011 championship that Nowitzki won really cemented his legacy as like a top 25 guy. I think for just about everybody. I think it would have been difficult before that, but that championship had so much meaning to it, and the fact that they were able to beat that particular Miami team that everyone thought was unbeatable. And I said for a long time that championship for Nowitzki meant more than any of the championships that LeBron won until he won the 2016 championship. When he won that
Yeah,
2016 championship, I was like, okay, that was impressive when he beat that Warriors team.
absolutely.
Um, so for Nowitzki to do that and cement his legacy and be a guy that stayed in one place his entire career and brought that championship home to Dallas finally, their first ever franchise championship, and the legacy he left as one of the biggest international stars, one of the first big international stars in the NBA. All those things, I think, clearly cements him as a top 25 guy. And once again, you kind of just go back and forth in terms of personal preference. Uh, I give Barkley like the biggest benefit of the doubt of almost any of these guys that were great that never quite won a championship
Yeah.
because I don't blame the fact that he just couldn't quite beat Jordan, and and before that you had teams like the Celtics and the Pistons that were just so great, and those Philadelphia teams were also great, but they just didn't have enough to beat those teams. And then when he finally got to Houston, I think he was just too old at that point, and they just couldn't quite yeah they just couldn't quite do it at that point in his career. So Barkley, and of course Elgin Baylor is another guy from way back in the day that people probably don't remember. He was one of the best players ever to never win a championship, and it's
Yeah.
such a shame. But literally, they were going up against that Boston Celtics dynasty every single year for like over a decade. So yeah, but I definitely think you should definitely have those two guys ranked really high still in the echelon of greatest players, despite the fact that they never won a championship. Yeah, so from there, I think once again it just kind of depends on things that you kind of think are more important, whether it's
Yeah.
the type of player Barkley was or the type of player Nowitzki was, what they meant for their teams. Um, like for Barkley too, I also give him a lot of credit for the fact that that as soon as he went to Phoenix, he made Phoenix an instant contender and took them to the finals in '93 and was amazing that season. And once again, just couldn't beat Jordan, you know?
Yeah. No, it's a
um,
great point. It's a
yeah.
really great point. I had Elgin in this group, and he's the guy who probably fits the least in terms of, all right, he never won, right? And I think some of the same arguments that you're making for Barkley, as you mentioned, could be applied to Elgin. I think there's also a bit of projecting that I did with Elgin, because he wasn't the same player from an efficiency standpoint after he hurt his knee. He became more of a volume scorer after that. So I think like if he had been exposed to some more modern medicine and been able to have the sort of same access to recovery tools that the modern day players would have, his career would have been even greater, right? So I think with Elgin and Dr. J, Dr. J and the ABA, Elgin, sort of pre knee injury, they were so good and Dr. J obviously won a championship with Moses and in the ABA before that, but they were just so good. I out of respect, I included them, but I certainly understand with Elgin not winning, he could be included in the next year.
Yeah. All right. So let's go ahead and go to the next tier, I suppose, for you after that. So what are the players in this next tier?
So now I really am just kind of have a mix of all right, who are the best players by each position that I feel like are in this sort of next group. So this is not number. This is not organized by okay, the top of the list is the best. I mean, I think by position they would be, but these are just the players that I feel like sort of rise to the top in terms of the rest of the list for me. So again, these are great players. There are certainly tiers within this tier. I feel like that we can discuss. But these are such overall great players that I wanted to highlight as okay, they're sort of in that top 50 for me based on position. So there are a few guys I just want to call out first that I feel like are the sort of guys who I was really thinking about for whether they're tier two or this sort of next huge tier. So you mentioned John Havlicek, winning 2 titles in the '70s on top of the titles that he won with Russell, I think was huge, and he just lasted so long in that era that I want to give him his credit. I want to give credit to George Mikan, even though yes, we know George Mikan would not be, his skill set would not exactly translate to modern day basketball, but 5 titles and greatest player of his era. I think it just has to be said that he was an all time great. Bob Cousy as well, right? Like Cousy was amazing, an MVP, obviously a champion. I think he won maybe 6 rings with Russell. So I think he needs to be shouted out. I think with these lists, for me, the toughest guy to put often is Isaiah Thomas, because from a statistical standpoint, he just does not hold up from an advanced statistical standpoint. Traditional stats, I think he's very good, but advanced stats do not like Isaiah Thomas. But I think there was something about him, and he, like some of the other people on this list, he was someone who lifted his play in the playoffs, and he had some of the most memorable moments in league history. Right, the championship they didn't win in '88, limping around and almost winning Game 6 single handedly. He had like 16 points in 90 seconds in I believe it was '84 against the Knicks in the first round, the sort of deciding game of the first round. Like he was just a player who you could really say is a clutch player, right? And I know there's a debate about whether clutch exists, but I think he was just someone who completely elevated his game. So I wanted to shout out those players along with some of the modern guys, Giannis and Jokic, who I feel like, all right, if they're not here yet, they're on the trajectory to being potentially tier 2 guys. So let me start off with those players before getting into some others on this tier.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, for me, like my next 10 players on my list, for instance, I have Karl Malone 21, Isaiah 22, Havlicek 23, Dwayne Wade, Giannis. I already have as in my top 25. Pettit, Nowitzki, Kuzi, Scottie Pippen, and David Robinson. We can talk about
Sure.
some of those bottom guys here soon. I definitely think you need to have Isaiah relatively high. If you're going to do a top 50 all time list, I still think he belongs in like the top 25 to top 30 in everyone's list. I just think those three straight finals appearances and two championships they won against the Larry Bird Celtics and the Magic Johnson Kareem Lakers, and even beating the Jordan Bulls. I know
Right.
Jordan was still relatively young at that time, but I mean Jordan had to learn to beat those Pistons teams
That's
before
right.
he became a champion. I mean, I just think that winning those two championships in that era still is pretty impressive. And I know a
Uh,
lot of people hate those Pistons teams, the bad boy teams, but I still think you got to give Isaiah a lot of credit for being a winner, being a captain of that team, winning those championships. So I think he definitely deserves to still be ranked pretty high.
yeah.
And yeah, so the modern guys like Giannis and Jokic are a little tough. I think when it's all said and done, Giannis is probably going to wind up being probably a top 12, top 15 all time player for sure. So I already have him pretty high on my list. Jokic is down. He is on my top 50 list, but he's down a little ways. But honestly, it's because I haven't really redone this list since the finals.
Right.
I think him winning that championship this year, I think he's already catapulted himself into like a top 30 all time player now, and he's probably got 10 more years left or whatever. He'll probably be top 20, top 25 at least on most people's lists because I think you can debate he's been the most impactful big man that's played in like the last 10 years. The the back to back MVPs and almost won a third MVP this year. He probably should have. I think he's already catapulted into the list of all time greatest big men who ever played the game.
Yeah, I completely agree. And yeah, it really just looking at the accomplishments, right? So as you mentioned, two MVPs, a championship where he's the clear man, and elevating once again that elevation of the play in the playoffs. I feel like he somehow does that every year. So yeah, I have him really high, and I think he's just going to continue to ascend. And certainly there are limitations on defense. I'd still put Giannis above Jokic, for that defensive aspect. But I feel like Jokic is just such a dominant offensive force that he's really, really creeping up the all-time center list.
Yeah. And I have Mikan on my list. He's like in that next grouping in the 30s. And that's one of those things where Mikan you have to put on just because of his contribution to the game of basketball during the early days of the
Yeah.
NBA. Like the NBA wouldn't even probably have made it as a league if it weren't for players like George Mikan that really became the first superstars of basketball. So you have to put him on just because of the importance he had on the game of basketball. But it's hard to compare him to players of today or even players of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. It was obviously a different game, and it's hard to compare players of those eras. But I think you still definitely need to put Mike in on somewhere on your list if you're talking about 50 greatest ever, right?
Yeah, and I said Isaiah was the hardest to rank. Mikan is right there, right? I mean, you have to acknowledge that obviously his skill set would not translate. But I think that the best we can do is compare, strength relative to era, and he ranks very highly by that measure. So yeah, he was on in this tier for me, and you can make an argument for the tier above if we're really thinking about all right, how dominant was the player compared to his peers.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go ahead and go down to your next tier, I suppose. So who's in your next tier? How many players are we looking at here?
Okay, so this is just a mismatch of I'm going to go down by position group, and just identify. All right, here are the players who I feel like are in this tier. Sort of a big group of players. So it is a sizable list, but I feel like these are the guys that need to be mentioned, sort of going forward. So in terms of point guards, I have Chris Paul, Steve Nash, John Stockton, Jason Kidd, and Walt Clyde Frazier. Shooting guards, you actually mentioned something that I regret. I would actually put Dwayne Wade in that previous group that I mentioned. That sort of, I guess, would be my third tier as a player who can lead a team to a championship, and was one of the premier players of his era. So I would actually put Dwayne Wade in that above tier. The others who I have are Sam Jones, who I think is criminally underrated, Reggie Miller, Ray Allen, Clyde Drexler, and James Harden. Small forwards, another guy two other guys who I feel like I could argue are in that above tier: Kawhi Leonard and Rick Barry, along with Scottie Pippen, Paul Pierce, and Paul Arizin. Power forwards: Karl Malone, Charles Barkley, Dolph Shays, Anthony Davis, and Elvin Hayes. And then centers: David Robinson, Willis Reed, Patrick Ewing, and Dave Cowens. So it's really just, these are all time great players, among the best players at their position. Couldn't quite do it on their own. And again, that's why I need to think critically about Barry and Kawhi Leonard, because they have shown evidence of being able to lead teams to the promised land as the main star. So excluding those two, but I think generally these are all time great players who couldn't quite get to the mountaintop on their own, but were significantly, I think, ranked significantly high in terms of their all-time position rankings and their overall rankings in terms of NBA history.
Okay, and is that your final tier? Do you have
Yeah, I mean,
basically? Yeah.
I can certainly mention some of the others who are on the horizon, but I think this is an important tier because I think there's a clear cutoff for me after this in terms of the sort of next tier of players. And again, I think it's so hard to separate, to find that line, that I feel like tiers are important in this discussion. So yeah, in terms of actually ranking, this is my last tier, but I have others who are very close to this who I can identify afterwards.
Okay, so we'll discuss maybe some of those that were close but didn't quite make it. You
Sure,
you named off some names that I do not personally have in my top 50 that
sure.
we'll discuss here in a second as well. Like so for me, my next 10 names were starting at 31 on my list is George Mikan, Walt Frazier, Rick Barry, Elvin Hayes, Kevin McHale, Willis Reed, Steve Nash, John Stockton, Chris Paul, and Clyde Drexler. I think you mentioned all those 10 names, did you, or was there one that was missing? Yeah.
I did.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think all of them were on my list.
Yeah. Okay. And yeah, I don't think there's too much really to say about those 10 names. Once again, I feel like most people are going to talk about those 10 guys when they talk about a top 50 all time list. I think, yeah, I think all those guys just had too much of an impact at one point or another, like Rick Barry and the championship he won in '75 with the Warriors, and Willis Reed winning the two championships with the Knicks in '70 and '73, and being sort of the captain, the leader of those two championship teams. There was a team full of Hall of Famers in both instances, but it seemed like Reed was probably still like the captain and the leader of those champion the last great Knicks teams that they haven't won since then, unfortunately. So let me go through my final 10 names, and
Please.
we'll kind of go back and forth and talk about names that I have that you didn't have, and vice versa, basically. So my final 10 start off at number 41 with Kawhi Leonard, then George Gervin, number 42. Jokic is 43 on my
Mhm.
list. So like I said, I'll probably bump him up pretty significantly when I redo this list again sometime in the near future. He's probably going to already go much higher than that. I do have Dave Cowens at 44. I have Russell Westbrook at 45 on my list. Patrick Ewing, 46. I have James Worthy at
Mhm.
47.
Yeah,
I have Sam Jones at 48. So I'm glad you mentioned Sam Jones because I do feel like
yeah.
Sam Jones is a guy that gets left off of a lot of people's lists now. And I think it's a bit of a shame. And then I
Mhm.
have Allen Iverson 49, and I finished my top 50 with James Harden at 50.
Yeah,
So there's definitely as you get through like 45 through 50, it gets tougher and tougher and tougher to kind of finalize your final five guys. And you're going to leave off some great players. Like I left off Reggie Miller, I left off Paul Pierce, I left off Jason Kidd, which is probably the name that's probably going to, I don't know, draw the most ire from a lot of NBA
Mhm.
fans because I do think if you ask most people, if you ask 100 NBA fans, I think about 90% of them would probably put Jason Kidd on the top 50. He doesn't quite make it for me, and I guess I could try and give reasons. I mean, it's kind of hard. I do think that Kidd was very successful in an era that I don't think was so great for the NBA. I think the late '90s, early 2000s era when Jason Kidd was at his best was probably one of the worst eras of NBA history in terms of overall talent. And outside of the Lakers team that nobody can beat with Shaq and Kobe, and the Spurs teams with Duncan, I just don't think there were very many great teams and very many great players during that era. And so I think a lot of kids' greatness got hyped up during a time when there just weren't very many other great players. And he didn't win a championship. He only won a championship when he joined Nowitzki and the Mavericks in 2011 team. I don't know. I guess I just don't quite put Kidd on the same echelon as the other great point guards like Chris Paul and Walt Frazier and Kuzi and a lot of the other guys that we've put on both of our lists. So, what's your reaction to that? Me leaving Kidd off of.
Yeah, I think it's a good debate. What I would say is I completely agree with your point on, not all finals appearances are made equal, right? So when we think of Allen Iverson and Jason Kidd, right, in '01, '02, and '03, those appearances, the Eastern Conference might have been the worst conference, at least of my lifetime, right? So, okay, congratulations, right? Like Iverson beat like the Ray Allen, Glenn Robinson, Sam Cassell Bucks, right?
Now,
Great.
I do give Iverson maybe a little more credit than Kidd because he won the MVP one of those years. He
He
also
did.
literally led a team to the finals where I think the second greatest player on that team was like Eric Snow or Aaron McKee or whatever. Like
Yeah,
that
they
Philadelphia
had
team was
no
not
offensive
good.
talent. They had Matumbo, but they had no offensive talent, right?
Yeah.
Like zero. So you're right. Aaron McKee was probably their next best scorer. So yeah, I acknowledge that, but like they weren't exactly facing. They almost lost in the second round to Vince Carter and the Raptors, right? Like it was
Yeah.
it was really really close. And then same for those Kid teams, right? Like I give him a ton of credit because those Nets teams were awful with Stephon Marbury, and then Kid comes in, and all of a sudden they're winning 50 games and they're going to the finals. So I give him credit, but also if they were in a Western Conference team, they probably are a second round exit. So yeah, it's really one of those things where I give him credit for the finals appearances, but in context, that was an absolutely awful conference, and they if they were in the West, they wouldn't have come close to the finals. So I agree with that. I think Kid, I really loved his late career transition on the Mavericks. He lasted a long, long time and was an effective player in multiple contexts. And yeah, I like him a little bit more than a Westbrook, who I know is on your list. And Westbrook, I can't get over the fact that he's so ball dominant and he's so non-malleable, right? Like Westbrook can only play one style and is really hurting him late in his career. Whereas Kidd, you saw that beautiful transition that he made into sort of being a supporting player on those Mavericks teams. And Kidd, I think what puts him in this tier for me is the defense. I think you can argue about his offense and his shooting, especially early in his career, but he was a rock solid defender, really an all time great defender. So that's why I have him in this tier. But I think it's a good debate.
This is obviously the point in the list where you can have lots of lengthy debates
Yeah,
with all these guys because you're really having to fit in, like I said, like these five guys as opposed to these five guys, and it's tough because they're all great, obviously. Westbrook for me, I know Westbrook is going to be a real interesting debate for a lot of people from now until probably the end of time, because I think you either really love Westbrook or you just hate him,
yeah,
and I get it. I love Westbrook, of course. I'm from Oklahoma City. I'm a pretty biased Oklahoma City Thunder fan, so that probably does have something to do with it. Not gonna lie. It's Westbrook. I mean, I watched obviously everything from like 2010 to 2018, 19. And to see Westbrook become the dominant player that he became, as opposed to how he started off in the league and how just bad he was as a passer, and then became actually one of the greatest passers in the NBA. And I think that's a really very underrated thing people don't talk about when they talk about Westbrook is that he really became a fantastic passer. He is one of the most athletic players we've probably have ever seen play the
yeah.
game, maybe even more so than even guys like Iverson or other guys that you kind of think of. And the way he dominated, and I know people complain about stat padding and things like that. But the fact that he did things as a guard that no one has done in the league since Oscar Robertson, I still think that that puts you in like some really truly rare categories of all-time great players. I know he hasn't won the championship. Neither has like James Harden or some of these other
No.
guys that we're talking about, Chris Paul. Uh, maybe they'll get there one of these days. We'll see, and that'll probably depend a lot too about their final rankings on these lists. Like, can Chris Paul finally win a championship? Can
Yeah.
Harden win it somewhere, whether it's LA or wherever else he wants to go now that he doesn't want to stay in Philly? Was this his third team that he's wanting to wanting to be traded from? So, like, Harden is a really interesting guy too, because Harden would probably be ranked a lot higher on people's lists, but it's just the fact that he's had so many flameouts in the playoffs, and the
Yes.
fact that he can't seem to be happy in any situation that he's in. Like, I think you got to knock him down for those
Yeah.
things. What do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Statistically, he's a top five shooting guard ever, and he's probably not five, right? Like statistically, if you look at him during the regular season, you're talking about Jordan, Kobe. If you characterize Jerry West as a shooting guard, and then it's him, right? Like statistically, but there's no way I would ever put him above a Dwayne Wade. Truthfully, this is why I have people like Sam Jones and Reggie Miller above him, because I feel like you know what you're getting with them. And Sam Jones and Reggie Miller, particularly, are two players who always elevated their play when their teams needed them. James Harden does the opposite, unfortunately, in a lot of situations. So, yeah, Harden is a really really tough guy. There are certain players throughout history where you see their regular season performance and it doesn't quite match their playoff performance. Unfortunately, one of my favorite players of all time, David Robinson, sort of falls under that category as well. It wasn't as extreme as Harden, but David Robinson is one of the greatest centers of all time. If you look at the regular season, he's one of the greatest regardless. But like if you look at his regular season stats, he's right there with the all time greats like the Shaqs, the Hakeems. Like he is right there, but he didn't quite play up to par in the playoffs, and it wasn't just the Kareem series. It was multiple times. If you look at his playoff stats versus his regular season stats, they just don't compare. So, yeah, it's very tough to characterize those guys. Robinson at least had the defensive factor that was always present. Harden, I just can't put him too high because of his limitations and whatever happens to him under pressure.
Yeah, and yeah, like I said, he's right on the cusp. He's number 50 on my list, and
Yeah,
it was difficult determining like him versus Reggie Miller. Like Reggie Miller is like yeah Miller, Miller, Pierce, Dominique, Bob McAdoo are probably like would be like the four guys that just didn't quite
yeah,
make my top 50 list. And maybe on a particular day, who knows? I might just go ahead and change my mind and put them in there because I think it's Miller's tough too because he also never quite won the championship.
yep,
He never won like an MVP. He never had like a season where he was like as dominant as Harden was like in 2017, 2018. But Reggie Miller was just always great. He was always consistent. He was one of the greatest shooters of all time. And he still has so many great moments in playoffs, even though he didn't win the championship. But those Knicks series, him going up against the Knicks and Spike Lee at the same time, those series against the Bulls in '98, where they almost beat Michael Jordan and that Bulls team, that final great Bulls team. So I mean, he had some great moments in the playoffs. He just never could quite win it. Harden, I don't even think you can even think of a great moment in the playoffs. Like I guess the time they almost beat the Warriors in 2006 or
right.
2018 might have been
Mm-hmm.
the best moments, and then he stunk it up in Game 7. What? So it's like anytime you think of a potential great moment, then you think, yeah, but he also stunk it up the next game, and that's why they lost the series. So it's really difficult. So yeah, it's a definite back and forth. I think that almost anyone can have. Um, like other tough ones, like I have always had, I think, a higher uh, a higher ranking of guys like James Worthy than a lot of other guys. I think Worthy misses out on many people's lists because I just think that people don't give Worthy credit because of the fact that he always for his entire career played on one of the greatest franchises ever. Those Lakers teams
Mm-hmm.
from like 81 to 89 or 90. just one of the best franchises that's ever existed with Magic and Kareem and Worthy and a plethora of great role players. It's tough because we never got to see Worthy be his own guy until late in his career when he was getting close to being retired. So he's always a tough one to kind of know where to kind of put him in the echelon of greatest NBA players. And Sam Jones is probably the same way too, obviously, because he did nothing but play with great Celtics players like Russell and Kuzi and all those guys in the great teams of the '60s. So it's hard to know for sure where to put a guy like Sam Jones because he never really got to shine on his own like a Reggie Miller did or Paul Pierce did.
That's right. Yeah, Sam Jones is a tough one. Looking at accolades, he probably doesn't. He would go below the Drexlers, the Hardens, some of the other great shooting guards. But yeah, I mean, his 10 championships, and again, obviously he wasn't. You had Bill Russell there, right? You had Kuzi for part of it, Havlicek. You had great players, but he always elevated his game, right? And Sam Jones was such a key part of those. I don't think that can be discounted. So yeah, I have him much higher. I feel like than most, just because of his clutch play and his reliability during those championships.
Were there other guys that I mentioned on my list that you didn't quite have that you wanted to talk about and talk about why they didn't quite make your tiers, or anyone else that didn't quite make your tiers you wanted to go ahead and mention?
Sure. Yeah. You mentioned Gervin and Iverson. I didn't quite have. I have those two grouped together. They both won, I believe, 4 scoring championships. Right. They both were, probably not the greatest defenders. Right. Iverson, had a lot of steals, but I don't think, that was necessarily his strength. Gervin, it certainly wasn't his strength. Gervin was a much more efficient player, but I bucket these two in the sort of same group. And again, Iverson had the MVP in the finals appearance, but I kind of look at them as sort of very similar players, and I have them right on the cusp of this. But I didn't quite put them in this tier. And you also mentioned Kevin McHale. Looking at it, I could probably put him in this list. He was so good as a complementary piece, and he was a two-way player as well. So yeah, you have him, and he's right on the cusp too. I think in terms of just raw play, I'd probably put him above an Elvin Hayes. Elvin Hayes is a very controversial player who I included in the tier, but Elvin Hayes, he had longevity going for him, and despite all the stuff surrounding Elvin Hayes, like he wasn't the greatest teammate and shrunk from the moments. He was arguably the best player on a championship team, right? Those 78 Bullets. That was kind of a mix, and you had Wes Unseld, but I think you could make an argument, right, that Elvin Hayes, Bobby Dandridge, Wes Unseld group, in terms of who was the best player. So
Wes
and
Unsel's Wes Unsel's another tough one. He probably would have
very
been on
tough.
my list if he just had maybe a few more years, because I mean, his career from like 69 to 74, 75, something like that, he was dominant. He was one of the
Yeah.
more dominant players in the league. Not so much after that. Even that Bullets championship in '78, he wasn't really the same player at that point as he was earlier in his career. So it's really tough. If he had a few more years of being as dominant as he was when he first got in the league, he probably would have definitely been on the list.
Yeah. Wes is rock solid. I have him right below this tier. Another guy who is right on the cusp for me is Bill Walton. He just didn't have the longevity, but we know what he could do when he was healthy. Right? He was such a force. But the longevity, I just couldn't put him here just because of his shortened career. But I think we all know what he was capable of. The other guy I think is on the cusp for me is Gary Payton. When we think of like two-way impact, being one of the greatest defensive guards of all time, I think what prevented me was his offense. He'd score a lot of points, but he was a terrible deep shooter. He was one of those like high volume, low percentage 3-point shooters, and he kept checking them up. And again, that's fine. Like that doesn't prevent you from being on this tier, but I didn't quite have him. If you look at my sort of point guard tier with the Walt Fraziers and the Jason Kidds, I just thought they were slightly above GP, but I certainly understand the argument if you want to include Peyton in that group. But yeah, those are kind of the players who are right on the cusp. but I didn't quite make it for me. One other guy I do want to shout out, who was in my list. Another guy who just I feel like is very overlooked, and best player on the championship team, Dolph Shays, excuse me. Again, no one's talking about Dolph Shays these days, right? Understandably, but great power forward, ranks very highly for me. And you think about the list of power forwards who were the best player on the championship team. It's few and far between, and he's one of them. So I think he needs to be recognized, and that's why he's in that fourth group for me. So yeah, I think those are the main ones. And Paul Arizin was another guy that I included, where he was a two-time scoring champ. He was a champion. Great career, and I just feel like he's just one of those old school players that isn't quite on the radar for most people. But I think he did enough in his career to warrant inclusion.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when it comes to NBA history, you can definitely, at this point in time, since we've gotten, what were we at, year 77 of NBA history, you can definitely sit down and do like a list of 60, 70 all-time great players and names and have no issue probably filling out your list. So when you're trying to condense into just 50, you're going to leave off like 10 to 12, if not more, like really great players. When it comes to the guys like Dolph Shays and Paul Arizin, obviously I have several of the all-time greats from like the first 20, 25 years on my list, but it gets hard putting too many people there from that era. Um, Especially once again, you're comparing modern eras or even like eras of like the 70s, 80s, and 90s to the first 20 years or so. So I do have a hard time knowing where exactly to kind of put guys like Shays and Arizin,
Yeah.
Bill Sharman, some of those other names of the first 20 or so years of the league. I obviously still have Mikan and Pettit and Kuzi on my top 50 for sure. I was like, I got to put them somewhere in the top 50 for sure. There's other guys it's really difficult. It's like, do I put Shays in or do I put James Worthy in? Do I put Paul Arizin in or do I put George Gervin in? Like
Mm-hmm.
it does get rather challenging. Um, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Bill Walton. Bill Walton's another tough one because once again, for like 4 or 5 years, Bill Walton was the most dominant force in the league. He beat Kareem when Kareem was still young. They won a championship in '77 when no one thought that team could win a championship, and they were great the following year until he got hurt. And yeah, and then unfortunately his injuries, he just never was the same player ever again. I mean, he had that moment in '86 when he won the championship with the Celtics, but that was kind of about it. So it's a real shame. He definitely would be a top 50 guy if it wasn't for his injuries. Other names I think people talk about a lot are like Pete Maravich, but Maravich is it's very hard for me to rank. I don't know what to do with Maravich, to be perfectly honest. He was probably the most skillful player that has ever played the game for sure. But once again, it's a combination of his injuries and the fact that he honestly was never he was never the guy to elevate a team to the level of being like an NBA Finals team. He just wasn't that type of player. He was extremely fun to watch. He could break all the scoring records and all the assist records. And if they had a 3-point line back then, yeah, he probably would have. I mean, who knows what he could have been averaging? He probably would have been averaging 40 and 20 a game or something like that. He probably could have had like Will Chamberlain like numbers, but he was never that guy to really actually elevate a team to greatness, even when he was still at his greatest. So he's a rather difficult one to try and rank for sure as well. Him and Walton and Unseld are like that trifecta of guys. It's like, man, if they would have just played a little bit longer, if they would have been able to show more for at least a little bit longer, then maybe they would have definitely been on my list. But I just can't quite put them on my top 50.
Yeah, I completely agree about Maravich. I think the myth around Maravich, and the skill, like no one's doubting how skilled he was, and I think you make a great point about the 3-point line. He would have thrived with that, but his impact on winning just wasn't there. So he wasn't even a borderline person for me in terms of being in these tiers. I think he's at the very low end of the NBA 50 and the NBA 75 lists. Again, great player, super entertaining. Just doesn't rise to that level for me.
Yeah. I am so glad you mentioned like Gary Payton. He's another guy that, gosh, I wish I could put him on my list. He didn't quite make it for me, but I get it. If people want to put him in the top 35 or top 40 or whatever, I completely understand because it's hard to, he does. He once again, he doesn't have the numbers of some of the greatest point guards that have ever played, but the impact that he had as a defensive guy, as a defensive, just bottom line, probably the best defensive guard we've ever seen play the game of basketball. And that's saying quite a lot because we have had quite a few on that list that have been great. And how he was able to elevate that Seattle team to almost beating those not just the Jordan Bulls, but probably the best Jordan Bulls team that ever existed, that 95-96 team, and how great that final series was that people tend to forget about. It's hard. I would have liked to put him on my list. He didn't quite make it for me, but anyone who wants to put Gary Payton on their list, I have no problem with that, obviously.
Yeah, he's right there for me. Big time scorer, really in an era where, the point guards now, I think the point guards are, there's so many score first point guards, but that wasn't necessarily the case in the 90s. And he kind of set the tone in terms of being a score first point guard, but who also was on some really great teams. And, a lot of people tend to remember the first round exits in 94 and 95, right? But to your point, 96, 64 win team, went to the finals, went to 6 games with the Bulls. And then 93 before that, right? Like they made game 7 against the Suns in the Western Conference Finals. So they easily could have made two different finals appearances during that era. So yeah, great player, right on the border for me.
Yeah. All right. So I think this was a fun exercise. I think we've touched on pretty much every single player that I feel like needed to be talked about in the context of who are some of the all time greatest players. And once again, I think if you are a basketball card collector, I think it's important to know your NBA history and to know about these players. Like I said, that a lot of guys that we talked about that maybe even are just kind of on the cusp of being considered in most people's minds the 40 or 50 greatest or whatever. But I still think it's important to know. Like I think like it's important to know Paul Pierce and the greatness that how great he was. And if you want to collect from that era, I think that's the guy you want to focus on because a lot of people focus on Tim Duncan and Dirk Nowitzki and some of those guys. But I was like, well, no, I think you should also be focusing on Paul Pierce because he was also one of the better players in that era. And so, yeah, so I think it's important to kind of go through this exercise because I think it's just important to know your NBA history. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. Thank you for setting this up. I think it's a great idea, and for me, it's a good way for me to organize my collection. Just thinking about, hey, which of these rookie cards do I have? Which of them do I need to get? I really love to collect by era, so this was a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. So once again, if you want to see more sort of lists kind of like this, go to bballhistory.com and you'll see some interesting lists that Chris has done for some of the all-time great teams and great positions throughout NBA and college basketball history. It's a lot of fun going through his website and his Instagram. Is there anything else you want to make sure to shout out or mention? Any other social media or outlet that you do?
No, that's it. Really, now I'm more geared towards Instagram. So BBallhistory1 on Instagram. That's where I'm posting my collection and really going through rookie sets and sort of what I'm sorry, different sets in basketball and which ones sort of have the best rookie classes. So
Oh
that's been
yeah.
a fun exercise that I'm sort of going through on Instagram. So yeah, that's where my latest stuff will be.
Yeah, I forgot about that list. That's another fun one. Obviously, you've got some crazy sets to kind of think about because of the gaps in the years that basketball cards weren't produced, and so many of like the 61 Fleer, 69 tops, 86 Fleer. You can just name those three off the top of your head of like, yeah, there's that it's incredible rookie class for those three sets, and it's a lot of it because there weren't very many basketball cards being made, before them. So kind of kind of virtue of just fate, that they want to being so
Exactly.
great.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So it's just a fun way of, not writing a full blog post anymore, but just kind of posting some cards that I have, and also just thinking back about the best sets for rookie cards. So yeah, it's just a fun exercise.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, man. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this afternoon. Yeah, thanks for doing this list with me. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.